Hi, everybody. I know we still have a few people funneling in, but I wanted to start off by welcoming you to our first semi-annual regulatory update webinar. I'm Molly Vidler, and I'm here with Tenstreet's Transportation Advisor, Marilyn Surber, and our special guest, Dave Heller, TCA's Vice President of Government Affairs. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. For everyone else who's joined us today, welcome and thanks for hanging out with us for the next hour. I have a feeling this webinar is going to provide a lot of value to you all, and I'm excited for what all you can learn. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and sent to you within the next 24 hours, so don't worry if you get interrupted or have to jump off the call. We'll send you a recording to your email address tomorrow so you can review it at your convenience. Additionally, feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. You can do so using the text box under the questions section in your GoToWebinar panel. We'll answer as many as we can during our question and answer session at the end of the webinar. With all of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Dave and Marilyn and let them get started.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you. I want to just say a special thank you to Dave Heller. He's so good to us. He's always great about joining us a couple times a year and helping us and making sure we know what we're supposed to do and we can provide that information to all of our clients. And so we're just really thankful to him and TCA for that. And I personally am thankful because whenever I share a webinar with Dave, I barely have to talk at all, and that's pretty unusual for me. Those of you that know me. So I'm going to be quiet now and turn it over to Dave, and then we'll have a little bit of Tenstreet update at the end. And as Molly said, feel free to jump in and write your questions out with any time, and we will get to them. So without further ado, my friend Dave.
Thank you, Marilyn. My goal during all this is to try and keep you as quiet as possible, which is nearly an impossible task, but I try to the best of my ability, to say the very least. Welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I see a bunch of my good friends on here, so certainly I imagine they'll all have some questions for us at the end. But let's get right into it. And if we can just advance to the next slide. Probably the next one that has the pictures on it. All right, this is kind of an important slide here, and we're going to talk about things that are going on in DC. And kind of one of the most important things that is going on in DC is FMCSA is under what we call new management, if you will. And that new management actually equates to there's going to be a new administrator at FMCSA who has recently been nominated. She was officially nominated on April 6th, and that's Robin Hutchinson. And the reason this is so important is because this is set to play out. All the rules and regulations are probably more set to play out at the agency level rather than Congress. We have an infrastructure bill out there already. It got passed, it got voted up. We are operating under that bill, and that bill gave direction to FMCSA and Department of Transportation on actually some takeaways in which they now must move forward with, which makes FMCSA now the key player in moving along or proliferating new rules to the trucking industry. What makes this even more interesting is here we are in 2022, we're in the year of a midterm election, and certainly that does play a role because Congress most likely is not going to take up any one-off bills, and your big, large omni-type pieces of legislation have already passed, with the exception of a probes bill during this summer, and it being a midterm election year. Whether or not that approach bill will be clean or not leaves much to be said. And by clean meaning, will there be any amendments to it? Will there be any riders thrown onto it? So that becomes the big question, if you will, and where it goes from here. So at that point in time, this is how it plays out. We have a new administrator or a new nominated administrator. The hearing has yet to be set as to when they will officially hear her and vet her background and then vote her up. But at the same point, she has officially been nominated, and right now she's acting as the deputy administrator of FMCSA. Next slide. Probably the most important issue that everybody seems to talk about is labor. Where are we finding truck drivers these days? This is a trucking virtual meeting, so we're not all together in the hallway, but if we were, the question's going to become, I just can't find drivers. Where are we finding drivers? It has basically become a perfect storm for driver recruitment, if you will, and focusing on the supply chain crisis. You've probably seen Fox News, you've seen MSNBC, you've seen CNN, all talking about this supply chain crisis. Heck, you might have even seen me on Fox News, to say the very least. But at this point in time, it's been basically a perfect storm. Retirement has affected our industry. 54% of the lack of drivers right now, and we're operating in an industry that is over 80,000 drivers short. So certainly, one could say in the past, we've obviously demonstrated driver shortages before, but what makes it so important now is it actually is equating to empty space on store shelves, which didn't happen before. So that has made this supply chain crisis even more acute, and they're attributing 54% of that to retirement of drivers. The median age of the over-the-road truck drivers, 46 years old, and to say nothing of the COVID effects that we've just recently gone through and are certainly on our way back out of. Which gave some unemployment supplements and did affect some state testing facilities out there. CDL school enrollees were down during COVID, and the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse numbers have not been friendly to our driver numbers. And we'll get to some of those slides in a little bit to focus on the numbers of drivers that actually have been taken out of the system based on positive test results. To say nothing of the congestion at the ports, and that's not news to anybody, but it certainly does play a role into this crisis because they're not able to unload the ships in a timely fashion, much less get drivers to move them from the port inland after that. Next slide, please. You can see the number of job openings in transportation continues to grow. Trucking or transportation represents the #1 job in 29 states. So to say we're not a large industry would be an understatement. We are a massive industry in this country. Certainly delivering all the goods that go on the store shelves throughout this country. So when there is a driver shortage and there's an acute shortage right now, you can see some of these issues right now. 41.5% of drivers are minority. Women make up roughly 6.7% of the truck drivers in the United States. And the average hourly wage is $26.30. 7.95 million people held trucking related jobs in 2019. That's not just driver, that's trucking related. So that could be warehouse industry serving the trucks as they come into the warehouses, if you will. Where are all the drivers? That's a great question. If things go unchecked, we're looking at a driver shortage of about 160,000 drivers by 2028. Very real numbers that are certainly not far on the horizon if we keep things going by the way they're going. So in saying that, if we can advance the next slide, we do need new drivers to combat the shortage. We're going to need to hire an average of 110,000 drivers per year, and 54% of new hires will be needed to replace retired drivers. So that becomes the big thing: is where do we find these drivers? Well, one of the big avenues is effectively going to be the numbers that are before us when it comes to new for-hire trucking companies. You can see on the chart above you the massive influx of new for-hire trucking companies that were registered with the FMCSA, mostly independent contractors. And the question is going to be, if these are all coming in, how come it's not affecting the back numbers of that 80,000 driver shortage? Well, because most of these are drivers that are leaving their current carrier and going to start their own independent practices or their independent businesses, if you will. So it's one of those situations: is you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, or you're taking a driver from a carrier and putting them in their own truck running their own business, which is why that number hasn't gone down, as effectively the number of new for-hire trucking companies has increased tremendously. So that's why it hasn't affected that number on the back end. So you can see there certainly is a labor shortage going on right now. There is a flavor on Capitol Hill and the White House to actually get more drivers into the industry. I was at the White House probably about 3 weeks ago, and their talk was on some of the things we're going to talk about shortly: apprenticeship programs and attracting more people to the industry. Next, we do want to broach some of the things that certainly do pop up. The top 4 FMCSA violations as of 2021. Number 1 was allowing a driver to operate with a suspended or revoked CDL. This was the top violation for the 5th year in a row and was over 30% of acute violations. Notice the average fine is not a cheap amount of money, but there are some thoughts to this that a lot could be attributed because of COVID and some of the state driver's licensing agencies shutting down for a time or going to appointment only, which had prevented some drivers from renewing or re-upping their CDLs. Number 2 and 3 certainly pertain to drug testing or drug and alcohol testing and failing to implement the program altogether, or a random testing program. And certainly that does take effect in our industry. And there's some real dollars attributed to that, as high as $20,000 to $42,000 for non-compliance. And finally, number 4 is allowing a driver to drive with more than 1 CDL. So at this point, you see 2 CDL issues out there and 2 random drug and alcohol testing issues out there. So those are the top 4 violations of FMCSA FMCSA as they reported for 2021, which does bring us to the White House. And they issued what is called the National Roadway Safety Strategy, which was basically a report on improving safety on our nation's highways. What is interesting is none of this came as a shock, because most of these titles appeared in the infrastructure bill that did get passed last year. And that infrastructure bill did contain language for automatic emergency braking, lane departure warning systems, rear underride guards, and I emphasize rear, and excessive speeding was the flavor of this entire strategy, which makes sure we can actually expect rulemakings on all of these issues. Next slide, please. You can see emergency automatic braking was placed already on the regulatory docket for NHTSA to be put out there by April 30th. It has not hit the streets yet. They have tomorrow and then the month end. So clearly they're running late, but we are expecting a rulemaking on automatic emergency braking. And then finally, a rulemaking on lane departure warning systems will be coming shortly too. Now, the wide-standing belief is most people that are speccing out trucks and equipment these days certainly are speccing out this technology when they're ordering new equipment. However, getting new equipment is a challenge at best because the parts are having trouble getting to the manufacturer in time. I've heard as many as low as 30% of orders placed in 2021 will be delivered, leaving 70% of those orders unfulfilled. So there are challenges, if you will, when it comes to getting new equipment for those carriers to replace their old equipment on the roadways and incorporating some of this new technology. Next slide, please. Rear underride guards, as we talked about, FMCSA has already issued a final rule adding rear underride guard for roadside inspections. They're talking about a final rule to upgrade the existing requirements for rear impact guards on newly manufactured trailers and semi-trailers. Will be forthcoming shortly. Now, this is a standard that they're already making to. If you're buying new equipment nowadays anyway, this is a case where industry is well ahead of government when it comes to these regulations, and it's certainly one in which, as you buy new trailers out there, chances are they're coming with these upgraded rear underride guards as they are right now. So it's not something to be worried about. Certainly one of those things that's certainly being specced out on trailers as you're buying new ones anyway. Which finally brings us to speed limiters. Here's one of those things where we had the opportunity to predict the future when I laid out the slide. The expectation was that there would be a joint rulemaking from NHTSA and FMCSA. However, just yesterday at 5:04, a notice hit our inbox here at TCA. I'm sure it might have hit the inboxes of you as motor carriers out there, that FMCSA is moving forward or issued yesterday what is called a notice of intent. And that notice of intent has informed the general public that they will be issuing some Q&As for industry to answer regarding speed limiters with the intent on moving forward with what is called a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking on speed limiters. The magic question you all want to ask me is, that's great, Dave. What do those speeds look like right now? Well, that's one thing that is not mentioned in this notice of intent. There are some Q&A where they're asking industry to chime in. It's roughly 12 questions on speed limiting practices within your fleet. If you have them, they'd like to know more about it, and it's a simple Q&A. I do encourage everybody to complete that Q&A and submit them under comments to FMCSA. Once it hits the Federal Register, which it's expected to hit either tomorrow or Monday, there will be a 30-day window to submit those comments. TCA will be submitting them as well, but at the same point, this is one of those things that is not surprising. We've certainly expected this for some time, considering the prevalence of speed-related accidents on our highway, and certainly there are cases where it's not as high as highway-related speeds. It could be 45 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone, but this is that opportunity where the agency is taking to reduce those speed-related accidents. So basically what's going on is this notice of intent will ask industry for some Q&A or some information for which they could then form their supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. Once they form that, they will issue that to industry and take the information they've gleaned under the notice of intent, put it in the supplemental notice for more comments from the industry to see where it goes. Once they decipher all the comments that industry makes, it will then move forward to a final rule with the expectation of getting a final rule on speed limiters to the industry, and I'm going to ballpark probably within a year to 18 months. And that's where we are. This is one of those things that happened just yesterday, well after I designed this slide. So say at the very least, it's one of those things that we as an industry expected, but it certainly did get issued just yesterday. Hours of service, certainly not news, but one of those things that keeps popping up. On Monday, April 25th, so that was this recent Monday, they started hearing the arguments on the litigation that pertains to the current hours of service that we're operating under right now. More specifically, the short haul provision and the 30-minute break provision of those rules. The additional sleeper berth flexibility, or the 7 and 3 split, has not been challenged. It is expected and here to stay. It is one of those things that we at Truckload certainly support. We actually continue to advocate for additional flexibility of 5 and 5 and 6 and 4 split. So it's good news that the 7 and 3 is not being challenged. In fact, getting a 5 and 5 and 6 and 4 would be certainly more pertinent and more opportune for the industry to move freight as it's needed to be moving. You'll see before us right now the most significant barriers to daily hours of utilization. 35% is inefficiency of shippers and receivers. 28% difficulty locating adequate parking. Those become the two things that are most prevalent in our industry. And you'll see on the next slide that affects basically what is the biggest challenge to our drivers on the road today, and that's achieving actual usable driving hours. As an industry, we're averaging somewhere in the ballpark of 6.5 to 7 hours of drive time per day, and that's out of the 11 hours that the hours of service give our drivers. So probably catering more towards 6.5 hours. So issues like detention time, looking for truck parking, become that biggest issue as it goes right now. So 6.5 to 7 hours of drive time certainly leaves 4 hours on the deck that they're not using. And this is an opportunity for industry alike, that shippers, receivers, the trucking industry as a whole, and the government to get together to figure out the best way in which these drivers can make up that difference. All on the precipice of an MIT professor who testified before the Senate Commerce Committee that drivers are averaging 6.5 hours of drive time today. And they estimate that if every driver out there could get just 12 more minutes per day and get that number up to 6.7 hours of drive time, it would make up for the entire driver shortfall. Time spent at shippers, receivers certainly plays an active role in this, and getting them loaded and unloaded, probably doing some drop hook, trailer replacement type shipments would certainly play into this. But getting that extra time, 12 more minutes per day per driver of every driver on our road. So you're talking anywhere from 3 to 3.5 million drivers out there. If they had 12 more minutes of drive time per day, certainly could alleviate this massive driver shortage that we're experiencing and operating right now. At the same point, in an effort to alleviate that, we have the Got Truckers Act that was introduced on April 14th. And this is one of those acts that I want to be one of the people that gets to name these bills one of these days, but the Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act, which would remove the exemption for overtime under the Fair Labor and Standards Act. So as you all know, truck drivers have an exemption right now that eliminate them from getting overtime pay when they're working on their daily jobs. So that becomes the question is, where does this go from here? Certainly it has been introduced. It has been designed to reduce wait times at the shipper and receiver and get them loaded and unloaded in a quicker fashion, and probably capitalize on those 12 minutes that MIT professor is talking about in the world today. Now, is there really any opportunity for this to move? The question becomes that very real scenario, because these days bills just don't move by themselves. There's no one-off bill that gets voted up in Congress and said, hey, that's a great idea. It generally has to be attached to something larger. As I had said earlier, that something larger, quite frankly, doesn't exist in Congress right now, unless you're talking approach this summer. We had the infrastructure bill passed. We had some large pieces of COVID legislation that got pushed through, which are large pieces of Omni-type legislation that something like this could get attached to. But they don't have anything moving forward that something like this would really get attached to. So chances are this is something that may die on the vine. So is there a path forward? At this point, highly unlikely, because we are in the midst of a midterm election cycle in November, there is the expectation of the House to be in the Senate to both be challenged by the GOP, and neither side is going to want to give the other side something to claim victory over. So that becomes that very real issue of, can this get attached to PROPS? Will it be a clean PROPS in which nothing can get attached to it, which was the flavor last year around, and is that same flavor going to hold true this time around? Which remains, bills like this will be in limbo. There's some other bills we're going to talk about later, which certainly come into that same play. There was a recent study that was introduced to the industry. It was an ELD study, and it's pertaining to hours of service. Certainly, we all remember a few years ago when ELDs were new to the industry. And that study revealed that the number of accidents did not decrease with the introduction of ELDs to our trucks that operate on our roads today. In fact, independent contractors experienced an 11.6% increase in crashes, and carriers with 2 to 20 trucks had a 9% increase in crashes, and larger carriers remain roughly unaffected. The big thing, or thing that is important to note, was that the ELD was never designed to reduce accidents. It was designed as a compliance tool. It's the hours of service regulations that we could probably talk about all day that the ELD is proving that probably are not right as it pertains to the trucking world today. And it's the hours of service that are technically designed to reduce the accidents, not the ELD, which is a compliance tool. So it's certainly one of those things that, while it didn't reduce accidents, it's certainly one of those things that does measure hours of service that should be reducing accidents. As a result of the ELD rule, we did have a coercion rule that had gone into effect. And from 2016 onward, you can see coercion, or cases of coercion, never reached 1,000 cases. Its high point being 966 right before 2019. However, FMCSA is now predicting that we will go over 1,800 coercion cases in 2022 alone, based on current trends. Well, very much higher than recent numbers have suggested. So coercion is certainly playing an active role this year. The focus being on motor carrier, shipper, receiver, and or the brokers that are involved in putting those freight out on the road today. So the rule expressively prohibits coercing drivers to operate in violation of certain FMCSA regulations. So think hours of service, think time focused on the driver, where drivers may be forced to drive in a scenario where they may not be comfortable driving, they may be out of compliance driving. So that coercion is very real now, and as a result of the ELD rule that came out, we have this coercion rule, and certainly one that's starting to play a major role in how it's shaking out here in 2022. Canadian ELDs, for all our carriers that are operating in Canada, speaking of ELDs, there has been an additional enforcement delay of the ELD rule, stating that regulators in industry need more time to get ELDs out there to the Canadian carriers that operate. So that enforcement delay will go till January 1st, 2023, citing lack of devices as the reason. In Canada, they have 22 certified devices. 14 have been certified since December, with over 700 devices in the US. And there's a difference between the certification processes in Canada versus what goes on here in the States. In the States, it's a self-certification, if you will. The device must be designed to the specifications issued by FMCSA. In Canada, there is a third party that reviews each device to make sure it is certified to fit the parameters that the Canadians deem necessary to go on their trucks, which is the reason why there's only 22 certified devices in Canada and over 700 in the US. It is what's called assumed compliance in the US, much like they prescribe truck drivers to wear their seatbelts when they get behind the wheel of the truck. Doesn't necessarily mean all truck drivers are wearing their seatbelts. The same can be said for ELDs. Not all devices will be compliant, and I'm certain there are devices out there that aren't, which is why we have a revoked device list of those devices that didn't meet those standards, and certainly has begun populated since the rule was introduced. Entry-level driver training, I think everybody is in tune with this rule that had taken effect in February, and all students will undergo a 3-part curriculum comprised of classroom and behind the wheel training consisting of range and road. I think this is kind of the big rule that everybody is now operating under. If you are training entry-level drivers, you are to make sure that you are registered with FMCSA's TPR or Training Provider Registry, so that those students that are completing your courses, and that is even for the independent contractor who may be training their niece or nephew to drive a truck or get behind the wheel of a truck in their own private family-run business, they will have to register as well. So this is for your public and private schools, your carriers that are doing trainings, your community colleges, your high schools that may be taking up training, or even independent contractors that are taking it upon themselves to train relatives, or a prospective student certainly has to register as a training provider. The state driver's license agencies will record the behind the wheel curriculum hours completed by each CDL applicant, but it is fair to note that this is not an hours-based training. This is a competency-based training. So it is fair to note that there are not hours attributed to this rule. The go live date was February 7th, and there have been some questions that certainly have popped up. If we must go there and go to the next slide, some of those questions you can see before us is, do the regs go far enough with no specific time behind the wheel? That has been a major concern. Or do the regs create too formal of a process? Meaning, do you have a student that is a natural, someone that may have been driving a truck on their own private farm and get behind the wheel at a school and they ace all the classes, they're that dream student. So that becomes the big questions. And then finally, one of the things we've been experiencing here at TCA with some phone calls is creating a pause between the completion of your education and actually sitting for a CDL exam. And that may be actually a level of the type of environment that we're actually working in that has had delays at the state licensing agencies and creating that 2 to 3 week window where drivers don't have the ability to actually go in and start driving and earning a living. And carriers are concerned that they will be losing those drivers based on that time off, if you will, before they start earning. So that becomes the biggest concern, especially in today's age, when getting and attracting and retaining new drivers becomes the ultimate goal. Younger driver pilot program. This pilot program, this is the one we're all talking about or have been talking about, getting drivers 18 to 20 years old behind the wheel and operating in interstate commerce, is certainly one that we as an industry are expecting or want to experience nowadays, and still one we continue to wait for. The pilot program was originally proposed September 10th, 2020, and the reason that is highlighted in red is because it was proposed under the Trump administration. When President Biden took over, he quickly sunsetted this pilot program and moved it off the docket as a result of the administration change. Lo and behold, this got put up in the infrastructure bill, and now we have to have the agency actually reintroduce this pilot program, as we all know it, to get younger drivers, 3,000 of them, it's capped at 3,000, to operate in interstate commerce or be trained to operate in interstate commerce, which is different from operating in intrastate commerce as it stands right now. Now, the big question is when is this going to happen? That becomes the big question of the day, considering everybody is going down the road of these registered apprenticeship programs. Well, while these younger driver programs would be part of those apprenticeship programs, the younger driver pilot program is not yet active, and the expectation of it to be active is probably later rather than sooner. I've seen estimates as far off as early 2023 when this becomes active. I've seen fall of 2022. I've seen summer of 2022. So when this actually becomes active is all over the board. And all of these estimates are from our friends at FMCSA, and no two people there have the same estimate. So it's one of those things. When is this actually going to happen for an industry that wants to expose themselves to this demographic in hopes of having this demographic finding a career choice that fits them once they leave high school? So that becomes the big question mark, is when this actually comes into play. I know I've had several conversations on this very issue with our friends at FMCSA. It continues to be out there. It continues to be one of those things that we are not having the ability to move forward on. It is one of those things we keep waiting for the agency to move forward on. Driver training apprenticeship programs, you can see we talked about this already. There is a strong push to get these apprenticeship programs out there. I know here at TCA, we have a program or a registered apprenticeship program that you can register with here at TCA. I know ATA also has one. There are several other trucking industry associations that are pushing these registered apprenticeship programs through the Department of Labor. These programs certainly adhere to the previous or aforementioned ELDT minimum training standards, and it is for carriers and companies that train entry-level drivers. The apprenticeship registry when you partake in these programs can be done in as little as 48 hours, which is a massive change from what it used to be. You know, you were talking windows of 6 months to a year to get this registry done. Now it's been obviously pared down to as little as 48 hours, which could provide additional dollars for training drivers or additional drivers for salary based upon the programs that you may be exposing your drivers to, and tax incentives for training, which is now up to 22 states in its entirety, not 16, but 22 states in its entirety based upon the states that you train in. Apprenticeships, there's actually now, in relationship to those bills, there is a bill out there now that allows for tax credits for professional truck drivers out there. As you can see, it is 10,000 drivers for $10,000 tax credit for a new driver that is enrolled in a registered apprenticeship program, or a tax credit of $7,500 for truck drivers who drive at least 1,900 hours in the year. It's one of those situations, as a bill that's out there, does it have legs? We've talked about that legislative environment as it speaks right now, and certainly they're good bills to emphasize and highlight the profession of professional truck driver. At the same point, does it have legs to move forward, and can it get attached to something much longer? Because as I stated, nothing seems to get done alone in Congress these days. But to say that this one would be a good one to entice people to get into this industry would be an understatement, because a $10,000 tax credit is certainly very real dollars for those that would be entering the driving industry. ELDs, we talked about them briefly earlier, but the one thing we certainly need to be aware of, not necessarily for just ELDs, but for your telematics devices as a whole, is the transition from 3G to 4G technology. Whenever I show these slides, I feel like I'm a cell phone commercial. And if you can take it to the next slide, you can see the dates in which the 3G signal is being sunsetted. We've already surpassed 2, of which one was AT&T and one was a Sprint 3G or T-Mobile signal, which have both actually been surpassed, which means if you had devices that were operating on 3G technology, they automatically stopped working as of those dates or when those signals were sunsetted. This is all to make room for new 5G technology. Yes, those cell phone commercials actually are accurate, which is why they're trying to tell you to get new cell phones as well, because the 3G technology will stop working. You can see there have been extensions or brief extensions on some of these devices. First and foremost, both of them or one of them will be expiring tomorrow. The second one already expired on March 31st. So you can expect that there may not be a lot further extensions, if you will, for these devices. If you do have an extension because you're operating under one of these devices, you do have to maintain the document of extension in 2 places: at the principal place of business and within the vehicle itself, which means if you're operating with paper logs because you have an extension or something like that, that would be one of the things to do as well. Because remember, if these things stop working, you have 8 days to operate under paper logs, and then you actually have to have a workable device on you. So in saying that, remember, be prepared. If you don't have the answer to your device and whether it will work as of those dates, it is worth asking that of your ELD provider and asking them whether or not your device will work once this transition happens. They will be able to tell you whether or not it will be in good working condition under that transition, because if it is not, it will stop working, and then there will be bigger problems for your trucks on the roads today. Next slide. DQ file changes. I know Marilyn's going to want to talk about a couple of these things too. First and foremost, there is a change in 49 CFR 391.27 effective May 9th. It does eliminate the requirement for drivers to submit a list of all convicted violations. The theory being it is duplicitous in nature. Of course it is, and we do know that all drivers are honest 100% all the time, so there is no need for doing this. I'm kidding. At the same point, it will be removed. You will no longer be required to put these into your DQ file. It's that removal of certificate of violations, or that certificate of violations as it stands now. And effective May 9th, they will no longer have to self-report on that certificate and no longer need. Also, DQ file changes the driver training certificate. And that's that certificate that drivers get when they complete their training at a registered school with FMCSA. The theory being that the CDL is now proof of training. It's very important that you note that this training certificate is no longer required for drivers who have been trained on or after February 7th, 2022. Those drivers, that's when the new rule started, and those training certificates are held onto at the state licensing agency. Therefore, there is no need for them to furnish, no need for you to furnish the DQ file with those certificates. The longer combination of vehicle training will still need to be set and stored as the DQ file. Marilyn, did you have a comment? You said you wanted to talk about that for a second.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. So for those folks who use the forms in DQF through Tenstreet, we will have that updated form ready for you guys May 9th, whenever those changes go into effect. If you, for some reason, want to keep the COV as part of your process, then you are definitely able to do that, right? And we just want to remind everybody that you have to run the SID list, right? And an annual MVR on any driver's license that they've held in the last 12 months, right? So that is kind of something that reminded us when we were going through that, right? That needs to happen at the annual MVR as well as the time of hire. That's it for me, Dave.
Fantastic. Drugs and alcohol, certainly everybody's flavor of the day, if you will. I always make this public service announcement. Here is basically your weekly queries through January 30th of 2021. I encourage everybody to stop doing your limited queries in December and January and move that date probably to right now. May through June is probably the best time to do your annual limited queries. Why? Because everybody is doing them, and if you know anything about the IT bandwidth at FMCSA, you'll realize that yes, it's probably a good time to change those dates, because the last thing we want to do is crash those systems. IT systems or IT rules that have been IT centric certainly have had their challenges. Entry-level driver training being one of them, drug and alcohol clearinghouse being one of them. Certainly had their IT challenges going back to the past, so it's best to move off those end of the year dates when doing your queries. If you see people have started listening, the blue line is actually 2020 query dates, 2021 is the orange line, and you can see the end of the year has started coming down. So people have started listening and started transitioning to different times of the year to avoid those massive pitfalls, if you will, on limited queries. The same is for total queries, if you will. Go to the next slide. The same can be said for total queries. It's best to move them off of those winter or year end or year beginning dates to somewhere around mid-year. It makes the most sense, and it avoids any problems with the IT functionality at FMCSA. Next slide, if you will, which certainly brings us to these clearinghouse numbers. The big number I highlight right there is that 62,625 drivers. You want to talk driver shortage, those are the amount of drivers that have tested positive and have not yet begun the return to duty process, if you will. So that means 62,625 drivers have left our industry as a result of the drug and alcohol clearinghouse. Now, I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing. Nobody wants drivers with drugs and alcohol in their system operating on our roadways. I'm here to tell you that's just very real numbers that certainly contribute to the driver shortage that we're experiencing right now. It's important to note that 80% of the tests right now are positive drug tests that account for 82% of the total violations reported. And marijuana is by far the #1 detected substance. So the return to duty process basically hasn't been started by 62,000 drivers, and they have widely perceived to have left the industry altogether. Next slide. Oral fluid testing, there are comments that are due tomorrow for which DOT will then or could possibly incorporate oral fluid testing to your drug and alcohol testing programs. They did issue a notice of proposed rulemaking that they're already doing for government employees. This would incorporate it into your DOT drug testing programs to help combat instances of employee cheating, making it more economical and eliminating the direct observation aspect of the urine test or the problems with direct observation in urine, because it's easier, obviously, to directly observe people swabbing the inside of their cheek for oral fluid testing. It is offered as an alternative measure for carriers. And when I say alternative, it's not a replacement measure. It is an alternative measure. You are still more than welcome to use urine as your primary thing if this rule becomes final. Right now, it's still proposed, and they are taking comments. It is one of those things. Those comments are due tomorrow if you're planning on putting comments in. but it's certainly one of those things that they are looking to improve the drug testing collection process, which then leaves everybody to question what happened to hair testing. And the next slide you can see, hair testing guidelines had been issued as proposed guidelines, but it certainly were guidelines that we as an industry were not favorable to. In fact, the guidelines required a positive hair test to be followed up with a urine test. And basically, if you know anything about hair testing, following up with a urine-based test, they eliminated the need for a hair test in the first place in what I called a watered down philosophy. And the results right now as an industry for those carriers that are using hair testing are still not being admitted to the clearinghouse. So carriers are using hair testing for their own programs, not DOT specific programs, but for their own programs, and are certainly having success with it, but you can't admit those results to the clearinghouse. The University of Central Arkansas actually issued a study that cocaine and opioids are underreported due to urine-based testing. In fact, they are identifying cocaine and opioids at a double-digit percentage more frequently than the urine-based testing. And again, the clearinghouse issue does remain in effect for those carriers that are actually using these types of drug tests, can't admit these results to the clearinghouse. So cocaine and opioids are certainly being detected 16.2% more frequently than urine-based tests on these specific kinds of drugs. Next slide, please. Drugs detected, this emphasizes that. You can see the large detection of marijuana specifically in those carriers that are using hair, but at the same time, cocaine and opioids are there as well. So it's one of those things that continues to go down that road, and that's urine-based testing. You can see where cocaine is certainly not, and opioids are not recognized as much as they should be based on what's going on in the current urine-based testing. Next slide. Automated driving systems, certainly there is a flavor to start focusing on more automated systems moving in terms of rulemaking and rules that are at FMCSA. The trend being focused on rules and regulations that pertain to commercial motor vehicles where the occupants and driver may no longer be human, if you will. That becomes the big thing, is where do they go from here, is where we have a strong movement of getting autonomous vehicles out there, and certainly the rulemaking tends to go towards that thing. Certain tech renders now previous rules obsolete because of the fact, or the advancements in autonomous tech and advanced technology, advanced drive systems. So it's one of those things the agency keeps moving forward on and examining current rules and regulations that are out there right now in terms of FMCSRs and where it goes, and that's kind of where it's standing right now. Next slide, please. You can see, obviously, there is a market or a trend to start getting autonomous vehicles. You'll start seeing, if you read the trade presses like I do, you'll see that a lot of them are starting to incorporate automated trucks in the long haul specific segment. That's after it's loaded and before it's unloaded. That long haul segment of interstate driving or highway driving is being incorporated into autonomous technology. Is there equipment availability for this? That becomes the big question, and will they be able to pacify industry if this were to become a reality today? It's not going to be a reality. Certainly, that would be out there, but 94% of operator hours could be impacted with this type of technology. You talked about ways to improve upon that 12% or 12 minutes. That would be one of them. Legislatively speaking, there certainly is some activity out there when it comes to regulations and bills that are getting introduced to help improve the life of the professional truck driver. Certainly one that was out there was the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act that was introduced in March of 2021, which had some real dollars to put towards truck parking. Surprisingly, this bill did not make the infrastructure bill. It seems they're going by the way of the states to highlight those discretionary fundings to use those dollars to improve truck parking. This has become issue number one for the professional truck drivers out on the roads today. Traditionally, salary was, but truck parking, or the search for safe and secure truck parking, has surpassed salary when it comes to the needs of the professional truck driver. 98% of drivers regularly experience problems finding parking. equating to 56 minutes of drive time per day looking for parking, which equates to $5,500 in lost wages per year. Approximately 1 parking space for every 11 drivers on our roadways today, and 70% of drivers are forced into hours of service non-compliance due to lack of parking. So you can see this is a growing problem, to say the very least. Right here, this survey, 75% in 2019 regularly 1 or more times a week experience problems finding safe and secure truck parking. So this has become a real problem with real dollars needed to fix it. So it certainly has everybody talking on the Hill right now of how they can actually do this, which brings that discretionary dollars to the front of the conversation. But those are exactly that, discretionary. That doesn't mean they're just dedicated to that. Certainly the License Act of 2022 was introduced, and it would allow for third-party examiners to actually test professional truck drivers once they complete their education. The hope is that it would decrease wait times between completed training and actual job start time. We talked about that delay that had occurred earlier. This is one of those bills that is designed to circumvent that delay in hopes it can get done. But again, the question is can it get attached to something larger? Because very few things move by themselves these days. There is a thought to getting the pre-employment screening program changed to more than just pre-employment. And this would be one of those things that could be pulled year round. There are concerns, and one of those things that we would like considered if this does become a reality, meaning cost adjustments, because it becomes a yearly thing. Is there going to be cost adjustments rather than just on the pre-employment fees that you're paying? And could this be a push program rather than a pull program? I think every carrier on this call would love the fact that this information in this program was pushed to them, meaning that eliminating the need for them to go and look at it. So if there is a change, all of a sudden that information can be pushed out via email or alert or some sort of way in which they didn't have to go find it. There is a movement to get this into a bill. And finally, last but not least, there is a bill that has been introduced to combine the background checks for all 3 of hazmat, TWIC, and pre-check certifications. Currently, each of these programs required similar redundant background checks, and it would reduce appointment times as well as fees. And drivers could register at TSA pre-check facilities. So it would combine the hazmat, TWIC, and pre-check background checks all into one, eliminate the fees, and do it in one foul swoop, which makes the most sense. Certainly it is the level-headed thinking of me and everybody on this call that this would be a great idea. Surprised it took this long for them to get a bill that got introduced to do this. Whether or not it moves is an entirely different story. Next slide. Dates to remember. If you haven't registered, please feel free to do so. We have our Safety and Security Division Conference that is coming up in Nashville on June 5th and 7th. I know Marilyn's going to be there as well. And our call on Washington, September 12th and 13th here in Washington, D.C. And we'd love to see you at both events that are upcoming here on TCA's calendar. At this point in time, I know we went through it fast and furious, but Marilyn's got some updates from Tenstreet.
Yeah, thank you, Dave, so much. And really, I can't say enough good things about the TCA Safety and Security meeting, right? It's a really great meeting, tons of great people, tons of learning. And so if you can make it, definitely try to get there. Also a date from Tenstreet is we have a compliance webinar with our general counsel on May 5th at 2 o'clock Central. And so this will be pretty quick because we already talked about the COV changes. The TPR update from Tenstreet is, I just wanted to remind everybody that Tenstreet is a TPR for the hazmat only training, and we do have the theory portion training for the other classifications. And so if you have any questions about that or need any information, feel free to reach out to me or your advisor or your account manager. And so that was pretty quick. So let's go through and see what questions we have for Dave. So, okay, Dave, if a driver is due for their annual certification of violation under the old CFR 391.27 rule, drivers that are due May 1st through May 8th, do they still need to get a COV?
Yes, they still would need. This goes into effect on May 9th. So they would still need those drivers on or after May 9th.
Perfect, thank you. And do you know when the medical examiner registry will be working again?
I don't mean to laugh. No, I do not. And again, when we talked about IT problems and what have you, and bandwidth at FMCSA, that is another one of those rules that did experience problems with that. I do not have an answer for you in that. I haven't had anybody that's been able to give me an answer on that either.
Cool, thank you. We had some, here's another question. Any training for using the TPR? That's a good question. I think that, I thought I had seen some emails from FMCSA. Do you know about that, Dave?
I don't know about specific training. I know they have some pretty good FAQs that are on their TPR website that I've read through, and they're fairly easily understandable. They're not as regulatory centric or regulatory speak. They're layman's terms, if you will, for using the TPR and registering for the TPR. So I do know go to their website. The FAQs are actually fairly easy to decipher.
Cool. And it sounds like your sound is breaking up a little bit, but that's okay because it's 3:50 and I think we got all the questions answered. Oh wait, here's one more question. Carriers are required to verify a driver only has one active license in the United States. As a carrier, we've came across several drivers who have more than one active license. How should a carrier proceed if they encounter that? Having a driver contact their state licensing bureau has been taxing. Is there any other way to combat that besides that, Dave?
I wish I knew a best practice for you. I really do, and I don't. And that's probably the best case scenario. It is taxing. There's no doubt about it. And it's one of those things when you start seeing drivers that are coming across with more than one CDL. I don't have a best case scenario, and you would think in this day and age there would be a way to do it. Perfect world of wonderful thinking is a national CDL would probably be the best case scenario, but dare to dream of something that relevant rather than a state-by-state issued credential. I know when you get into that conversation, a lot of states get up in arms because of the funding they get because it's a state-level issued credential as opposed to a national issued credential. So no, I don't have a best practice for you. I really don't. It's one of those things that I think everybody has problems when they come across that.
Yeah, you're right. It seems like it's maybe not as bad as it was at one point, but
Yeah.
hopefully, yeah.
If you want to make a FMCSA at the federal level of their mouthwater, mention national CDL, and they'll certainly perk up and say, "Man, that's a great idea," but there's just not a way that would ever get done.
Yeah. Okay. And one, I don't think so during a DOT audit, after the requirement of the COV is removed, would you be required to have in the file to meet the 3-year retention requirement? So you have to keep it right for 3 years. And then after that, you shouldn't have to keep it anymore, right?
As I understand it, after the date it's affected, they will no longer be asking for it for drivers that are needing it. So if you have one that's probably within the 3 years, it will be okay that they see it. That's not a problem. But if it's not in there per that date, then again, it's been communicated to me that they will not be asking for it. Now, a lot of things happen in the translation from the federal to the state level, and there are 50 states across this country, of which all 50 of them don't always see eye to eye with the feds. There's going to be some growing pains with that.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Okay, and then we have another question. In regards to the rear impact guard, if a shop doesn't have this listed on their form, is this something a carrier should be worried about, even though the list isn't done? It isn't according to 49 CFR 396?
When it does become part of that inspection process, it probably is something you want to keep track of and putting it on that form.
Okay.
Because if they're going to start inspecting it, they're probably going to want to start looking at it specifically if it becomes problematic within a fleet.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dave. That was certainly a lot of information. We really appreciate you keeping us up to date and all of our clients and partners. And so don't miss our other webinars and the great TCA events. And thanks for sharing your afternoon with us, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Happy. Look forward to seeing you all at some point soon.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.